The first time I realized I no longer belonged to my own family was when I saw their smiling faces online, standing together on a lakeside dock I had paid for, and somehow, I wasn't there. It was a Saturday morning, just past 9 a.m., and the coffee in my mug had already gone cold in my hands. I remember staring at my phone longer than I should have, my thumb hovering over the screen as if touching it again might make me appear in that picture. Daniel stood with his arm around Rachel, both of them laughing at something just outside the frame, while my two grandchildren leaned against the railing, sunlit and carefree. The caption read, "Perfect Family Weekend Red Heart." Perfect. I read that word 3 times. I had helped cover the down payment for that lake house 3 years ago, back when Daniel said it would be a place for all of us. I remember believing him. I remember imagining summer barbecues, birthday cakes on the deck, quiet mornings with my grandkids fishing off the edge. Instead, I was sitting alone in my kitchen, wearing a sweater I hadn't taken off since the night before, trying to understand how a place built with my savings had become somewhere I wasn't even invited to. I didn't call. That was the strange part. The old me would have called immediately, asked if there had been a misunderstanding, if maybe they forgot to tell me. But something in that photo felt too complete, too intentional. No empty chair. No mention of me. No space left open. I set my phone down on the table and listened to the silence in my house. It wasn't loud, not dramatic, just steady and ordinary, the kind of silence you only notice when it's been there too long. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. Everything was normal, except it wasn't. I thought about the dinner I had planned for that weekend. I had bought fresh salmon, Daniel's favorite, and a pie from the bakery Rachel liked. I had even taken out the good plates, the ones I used to save for holidays. I told myself it was just a small family dinner, nothing special, but I still ironed the tablecloth that morning, smoothing out every crease with careful hands. By 7 p.m., no one had arrived. By 8, I had stopped checking my phone. By 9, I had wrapped the food and placed it neatly in the refrigerator, as if tidiness could somehow make the disappointment smaller. Daniel texted the next day. "Sorry, Mom. Things got busy." That was all. No explanation. No mention of the lake house. No mention of the photo I had already seen. I read his message once, then again, and noticed how easy it was to accept it on the surface. Busy. People get busy. Life happens. That's what I told myself at first. But as I sat there that Saturday morning, looking at that picture again, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness, not in the way I used to feel it. It was clarity. A quiet, steady realization that this hadn't happened all at once. It hadn't been a single moment, a single decision. It had been gradual, subtle, almost polite. Phone calls that came less often. Invitations that arrived later and later, until they stopped coming at all. Conversations that felt shorter, thinner, like something important had been removed. I thought about the last few holidays, how Rachel always seemed to be the one organizing things, sending messages, setting times. I thought about how often she would say, "Oh, I assumed you were busy," or "I didn't want to bother you." At the time, it had sounded considerate, thoughtful even. Now, sitting there in the quiet kitchen, I realized something that made my chest feel strangely light. I hadn't been too busy. I hadn't been hard to reach. I had simply been left out. And the most unsettling part wasn't that it happened. It was how carefully, how smoothly, it had been done. Like I had been edited out of a story I didn't realize I was no longer part of. I used to believe that distance happened all at once, like a door slamming shut, loud and impossible to ignore, but now I understood it could happen quietly, one small moment at a time, until you woke up one morning and realized the door had been closing for years. I sat at my kitchen table long after the coffee had gone cold, staring at that photo until the details began to blur, and then I set my phone face down as if that could somehow return things to the way they used to. The house felt larger than usual, not physically, but in the way empty spaces seem to stretch when there is no one left to fill them. I got up slowly and began clearing the counter, wiping it down even though it was already clean, moving objects from one place to another just to keep my hands busy. The quiet followed me from room to room. In the dining room, the table still held the folded cloth from the night before, the one I had ironed so carefully. I ran my hand over it, smoothing an invisible wrinkle, and for a moment I could almost see it the way it used to be, plates set, glasses catching the light, Daniel laughing at something I said, the children asking for seconds. It felt close enough to touch, and yet completely out of reach. I folded the cloth again, slower this time, and placed it back in the drawer. There was no reason to leave it out. No one was coming. I tried to think back to when things had started to change, but nothing stood out as a clear beginning. That was the unsettling part. There had been no argument, no harsh words, no moment I could point to and say that was when everything broke. Instead, there had been small adjustments, easy to excuse at the time. A holiday dinner moved to a different day because it worked better for Rachel. A birthday celebration shortened because Daniel had an early meeting the next morning. A weekend visit postponed because the children had activities. Each time, it made sense. Each time, I told myself it was just life moving forward. I told myself not to take it personally. I had always tried to be the kind of mother who did not interfere, who gave space, who trusted that love did not need constant reassurance. Now I wondered if that had made it easier for me to disappear. I walked into the living room and paused in front of the shelf where I kept framed photos, years of birthdays, holidays, and quiet moments captured in still images. I picked up one from 5 years ago, taken in that same lake house, back when it was still new to all of us. Daniel stood beside me, his arm around my shoulders, Rachel smiling at the camera, the children smaller then, their faces bright and unguarded. I remembered that day clearly, the way Daniel had thanked me for helping make it possible, the way Rachel had hugged me and said, "This is going to be a place for family." I held the frame a little longer than I needed to, then set it back exactly where it had been. Nothing about the photo had changed. Only the meaning had. I sat down on the couch and looked around the room, noticing things I had stopped seeing, the indentation on the cushion where Daniel used to sit, the throw blanket Rachel once said she loved, the small basket of toys I kept for the children that had not been touched in months. I realized then that it had not just been invitations that disappeared. It was presence. It was connection. It was the unspoken understanding that I was part of their everyday life. That understanding had been fading, quietly and steadily, and I had mistaken it for normal change. I leaned back and closed my eyes, letting the silence settle around me again, and for the first time, I allowed myself to consider a thought I had been avoiding. This was not accidental. People do not forget someone this consistently without a reason. People do not build new memories in places filled with old ones and simply overlook the person who made them possible. There was intention behind it, something deliberate and controlled, something that had been unfolding just out of my sight. And as that thought settled in, clear and undeniable, I felt something shift inside me again. Not pain this time, but awareness, the kind that does not fade once it arrives, the kind that changes how you see everything that comes after. I did not confront them right away because once you start looking closely, you realize the truth is not hidden in one big moment. It is scattered across dozens of small ones that suddenly begin to line up in a way you cannot ignore. I sat there that afternoon and let my mind move backward, not searching for something dramatic, but for the quiet details I had dismissed before. The first memory that surfaced was Emma's 7th birthday. I had asked Rachel 3 times what time the party would start, and each time she gave me a slightly different answer, casual, distracted, as if it did not really matter. On the day itself, I arrived 15 minutes early, holding a carefully wrapped gift, only to find the backyard already full, balloons tied to chairs, children running across the lawn, cake half eaten. Rachel had looked surprised to see me, her smile polite but thin, and said, "Oh, I thought Daniel told you we moved it up a little." Daniel had kissed my cheek and said nothing more. At the time, I told myself it was a simple miscommunication. That is what families do. They adjust, they move things around, they forget to update each other. But now, sitting in the quiet of my living room, I replayed that moment again and noticed something I had missed. Rachel had not apologized. She had explained. There is a difference. Another memory followed, then another, each one fitting into place with unsettling precision. Thanksgiving last year. I had called a week ahead to ask what I could bring, and Rachel had said they were keeping it small, just a quiet meal with the children. She suggested we celebrate together the following weekend instead. I agreed without hesitation. I always agreed. On Thanksgiving Day, I heated a small dinner for myself and turned on the television for background noise. Later that evening, I saw photos online. A long table. 10 people. Extended family, friends, neighbors. Daniel sitting at the center, smiling the way he used to when he was younger. I had stared at that image for a long time, trying to understand how small had become something I was not part of. When I asked Daniel about it a few days later, he seemed genuinely confused. "I thought Rachel told you," he said. I remember nodding, saying it must have been a misunderstanding. I said it so easily, as if repeating it would make it true. Then there was the school recital. I had marked the date on my calendar weeks in advance, even circled it in red. Rachel had texted me the time, short and simple. The night of the recital, I arrived early, found a seat, and waited. The auditorium filled slowly, parents chatting, children gathering backstage. When the program began, I scanned the stage for Emma and did not see her. By the second performance, I felt a quiet panic begin to rise. I checked my phone and saw a new message from Rachel, sent less than an hour earlier. "Oh, I am so sorry. I gave you the wrong day. It was yesterday." I remember sitting there through the rest of the performance, not because I wanted to, but because leaving felt more difficult than staying. When I called Daniel afterward, his voice carried that same confusion. "I thought you knew," he said again. I began to notice a pattern in those words. "I thought you knew. Not I forgot to tell you. Not I should have checked." Always the same quiet shift of responsibility, as if the information had existed somewhere and I had simply failed to find it. And always, Rachel at the center of it, delivering the message, shaping the timing, controlling the flow. I stood up slowly and walked back to the kitchen, my mind no longer drifting, but moving with purpose. It was not just that I had been left out. It was how consistently the story had been rewritten around me. Events adjusted. Times changed. Details altered just enough to make my absence seem like my own doing. I leaned against the counter and let that realization settle fully, heavy but clear. This was not forgetfulness. It was design. Careful, patient, and precise. And the more I thought about it, the more I understood that I had not been pushed away in one decisive moment. I had been guided out, step by step, until there was no space left for me to return to. Once I saw the pattern, I could not unsee it, and what unsettled me most was not just the consistency, but the ease with which it had all been done, as if it required no effort at all. Rachel had never raised her voice, never said anything openly cruel, never done anything that could be pointed to as clearly wrong. Instead, she worked in the spaces between things, in the pauses, in the small adjustments that no one thinks to question. I began to replay conversations in my mind, not just what was said, but how it was said, the tone, the timing, the way certain details were always just slightly off. There was a Sunday afternoon not long ago when I had called Daniel to ask if they wanted to come over for lunch. He hesitated for a moment, just long enough for me to notice, and then said they already had plans. His voice was careful, almost rehearsed. Later that evening, I saw a photo Rachel posted of them at home, the children in their pajamas, a movie playing in the background. The caption read, "Quiet day at home, just what we needed." I remember staring at that photo and feeling something I could not quite name at the time. It was not anger. It was something quieter, something that felt like being gently moved aside. I thought back to the way Rachel often spoke on Daniel's behalf, how she would answer questions before he had the chance, how she would step in with explanations that sounded reasonable, even thoughtful. "He has been so busy lately," she would say. Or, "We did not want to overwhelm you." There was always a softness to her words, a kind of careful politeness that made it difficult to challenge her without seeming unreasonable. And Daniel, he would nod, agree, accept her version of things as if it were his own. I began to notice how rarely he spoke directly about plans anymore, how information seemed to pass through her first, filtered, adjusted, then delivered. It was subtle, almost invisible if you were not looking for it. I walked into my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands resting in my lap, trying to understand when that shift had happened. Daniel had not always been this distant. There was a time when he called me just to talk, when he asked for my advice, when he showed up unannounced with the children because they wanted to see Grandma. That version of him had not disappeared overnight. He had been replaced slowly, piece by piece, by someone quieter, more cautious, someone who seemed to measure his words before speaking. I realized then that Rachel had not just been controlling information. She had been shaping perception. Not just mine, but Daniel's as well. If she told him I was busy, then I became busy in his mind. If she suggested I preferred to be alone, then my absence became my choice. It was not about excluding me directly. It was about rewriting the reason for my absence so that it never appeared as exclusion at all. That was the part that made it so effective. There was no clear conflict. No moment where Daniel would feel the need to question what was happening. Everything appeared normal, just slightly adjusted, slightly rearranged, until the result was the same as if I had been removed entirely. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street, the same one Daniel used to ride his bike on when he was 10 years old, the same sidewalk where I taught him how to balance, running beside him until he could do it on his own. I remembered how he used to look back at me, just to make sure I was still there. That memory stayed with me as I stood there, and I realized something that settled deep in my chest, steady and certain. He was not looking back anymore. Not because he chose not to, but because someone had quietly convinced him there was no need. And as that thought took shape, I understood that this was never about one missed dinner or one forgotten invitation. It was about control, about influence, about a careful, patient effort to redefine my place in his life until I no longer had one at all. The more clearly I saw what had been done, the harder it became to ignore what I had once believed about my place in their lives, because it forced me to look at something even more uncomfortable, not just how they had changed, but how much I had given without ever expecting to be replaced. I moved slowly through the house that afternoon, not because I was tired, but because every room seemed to carry a memory I had never questioned before. In the hallway, there was a faint mark on the wall from when Daniel was 12 and insisted on measuring his height every few months, pencil in hand, standing as straight as he could while I pretended not to notice him stretching just a little more each time. I had never painted over those marks. I used to think it was sentiment. Now it felt like evidence of a version of us that no longer existed. I walked into the kitchen again and opened the cabinet where I kept the extra dishes, the ones I bought years ago when Daniel told me they were thinking about starting a family. I remember that conversation clearly. He had sat at this very table, nervous but excited, telling me they were ready for the next step. I had smiled and told him he would be a wonderful father. I meant it. When the children were born, I was there for everything I could be. I took time off work. I stayed overnight when Rachel said she needed help. I learned their routines, their preferences, the way Emma liked her blanket folded just so, the way Noah refused to eat unless someone sat beside him. I did not think of it as sacrifice. It felt like continuity, like an extension of the life I had already built as a mother. When Daniel and Rachel talked about buying their first home, I offered to help without hesitation. It was not alone in my mind. It was support, the kind that flows naturally from one generation to the next. I remember the day we stood together in that empty lake house, the floors still bare, the windows letting in more light than furniture could fill. Rachel had walked from room to room, smiling, already imagining where everything would go. Daniel had turned to me and said, "We could not have done this without you." I believed him then, not because of the words, but because of the way he said them. There was no distance in his voice at that time. No hesitation. Just certainty. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes for a moment, letting those memories pass through me without trying to hold on to them. That was when I realized something that had not occurred to me before. Everything I had given had been tied to a version of the family that no longer included me in the same way. The help, the time, the presence, it had all been absorbed into something that continued to grow, just without me. I was still part of its foundation, but no longer part of its structure. And the strangest part was that no one had ever said that out loud. There had been no conversation, no moment where someone told me my role had changed. Instead, it had simply been adjusted around me until I no longer fit into it. I opened my eyes and looked around the kitchen again, seeing it differently now, not as the center of a shared life, but as a place that held echoes of one. I thought about the lake house again, about the weekends I had imagined, the birthdays, the quiet mornings. Those moments were happening, just not with me. And as that realization settled in, I felt a shift that was not as sharp as the earlier ones, but deeper, more steady. It was not just that I had been excluded. It was that everything I had given had made that exclusion possible. Without my help, without my presence in those early years, the life they were living now might have looked very different. I did not regret what I had done. That was not the feeling that stayed with me. What stayed was the clarity of understanding that what I had thought was permanent had always been conditional, shaped quietly over time until I was no longer needed in the way I once had been. And once that understanding took hold, it became impossible to see myself the same way again. It was not until 2 days later that something shifted from quiet understanding into something sharper, something that could no longer be explained away by memory or assumption, and it happened in the most ordinary way, through a conversation I had not expected to matter. I had gone to the grocery store that morning, just after 10 a.m., the kind of routine errand that fills time when there is no one waiting for you at home. As I moved through the aisles, I noticed how familiar everything felt, the same brands, the same layout, the same soft music playing overhead, as if nothing in the world had changed except the small, invisible space I once occupied in someone else's life. I was reaching for a carton of milk when I heard my name. It was light, almost uncertain, and when I turned, I saw Emily, my granddaughter's friend's mother, someone I had spoken to at school events and birthday parties over the years. She smiled warmly and asked how I had been, the kind of polite question people ask without expecting much in return. We spoke for a few minutes, exchanging small details about the weather, the children, the passing of time, until she said something that made the conversation stop in a way I could feel before I fully understood it. She mentioned how lovely it was to see everyone together at the lake house last weekend, how the children looked so happy, how it must have meant a lot to me to have the whole family in one place. For a moment, I did not respond. I simply looked at her, noticing the sincerity in her expression, the assumption that I had been there, that of course I had been there, because why would I not be? I felt a quiet stillness settle over me as I realized that from the outside, everything appeared complete. There was no visible absence. No one looking in would ever think to ask where I was, because the picture Rachel had created did not leave room for that question. I smiled gently and said something simple, something that would not invite further explanation, and we parted ways shortly after. But her words stayed with me as I walked through the rest of the store, moving slowly, not really seeing what I was picking up. It was not just that I had been excluded. It was that my absence had been rewritten into presence. People believed I had been there because they had been given no reason to think otherwise. That realization settled into place with a clarity that was impossible to ignore. When I returned home, I set the groceries down on the kitchen counter and did not unpack them right away. Instead, I stood there, looking at the items I had chosen without thinking: bread, milk, a small container of strawberries, and I let the weight of what I had just understood move through me without resistance. Rachel had not only controlled what I knew, she had controlled what others believed about me. If she told people I was busy, then I was busy. If she implied I preferred to stay home, then that became part of my identity in their minds. There was no confrontation, no open exclusion, just a quiet reshaping of reality that left me outside of it without ever naming it directly. I thought about Daniel again, about the way he always seemed slightly surprised when I mentioned something I had missed, as if it had never occurred to him that I had not been included. If he believed I had chosen not to come, then there was no reason for him to question anything. It was not just that he was distant. It was that he had been guided into seeing me differently, into accepting a version of events that removed any need for him to notice my absence at all. I slowly began putting the groceries away, one item at a time, my movements steady, deliberate, as if each action helped anchor what I was beginning to understand. This was no longer a series of misunderstandings. It was a system, a careful, consistent way of managing information, shaping perception, and maintaining control without ever creating a moment that could be clearly challenged. And as that understanding settled fully into place, I felt something shift again, deeper than before, not just awareness, but recognition. I was not just being left out. I was being replaced in the story of my own family, quietly and completely, in a way that made it almost impossible for anyone else to see what was happening at all. That night, I did something I had never done before, not out of anger, not out of suspicion, but out of a quiet need to see things clearly for myself without relying on what I had been told. I sat at my desk just after 8 p.m., the house dim except for the soft light of a lamp beside me, and I opened my laptop with a sense of calm that surprised me. I did not feel rushed. I did not feel emotional. I felt focused. I started with something simple, scrolling through old messages, not looking for anything specific at first, just reading them in order, letting the timeline form naturally in my mind. I noticed how conversations had changed over time, how earlier messages were longer, warmer, filled with details, while more recent ones were brief, functional, almost distant. Then I began to compare them with what I remembered. Dates, times, small details that once seemed unimportant. I opened my calendar and cross-checked events I had written down, birthdays, recitals, holidays, against the messages I had received. It did not take long before the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. Times that did not match, days that had been shifted, events that had been mentioned differently depending on who I spoke to. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen, letting the pattern unfold without interrupting it. It was not random. It was not careless. It was precise. Each change was small enough to be dismissed on its own, but together they formed something deliberate, something structured. I opened Rachel's social media next, not because I had any particular interest in what she posted, but because it was the only place where the timeline existed without filters, or at least without the ones I had been given. I scrolled through photos slowly, paying attention to dates, captions, the sequence of events. There were gatherings I had never been told about, outings that had been described to me differently, moments that filled in the gaps I had been left with. And what struck me most was how consistent the image was. A complete family. Smiling, connected, present. There was no visible space for absence, no sign that anyone had been left out. I realized then that what I had been given were fragments, carefully selected pieces that, when arranged, created a version of reality that excluded me without ever acknowledging that exclusion. I closed the laptop for a moment and sat in silence, letting that understanding settle. Then I opened it again and did something even simpler. I searched my own name in the message threads, looking at how often I had been mentioned in conversations I was not part of. There were very few results, and the ones I found were brief, almost dismissive. Phrases like, "she is probably busy," or "we will tell her later," appeared more than once, always attributed to Rachel, always accepted without question. I read those lines carefully, not reacting, just observing, and I felt something inside me become very still. It was not hurt. It was recognition. This was how it had been done. Not through confrontation, not through conflict, but through quiet decisions made on my behalf, repeated often enough that they became truth in the minds of others. I closed the laptop slowly and rested my hands on the desk, looking at nothing in particular, because at that point there was nothing left to search for. The evidence was not dramatic. It did not arrive in a single moment. It revealed itself in patterns, in repetition, in the absence of things that should have been there, but were not. And as I sat there in the quiet, I understood something that changed the way I saw everything that had come before. I had not been overlooked. I had been managed. Carefully, consistently, and without ever being told. And once I understood that, I knew there was only one thing left for me to decide, not whether it was true, but what I was going to do with that truth now that I could finally see it clearly. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because once you see something clearly, it becomes impossible to return to the version of yourself who did not notice it. The house felt the same. The light coming in through the kitchen window, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the familiar rhythm of a day that used to revolve around other people. But something in me had changed. I moved through my routine slowly, making coffee, setting a single cup on the table, sitting down without turning on the television or checking my phone. I did not need distractions anymore. I needed clarity. I thought about everything I had seen the night before, the messages, the timelines, the quiet adjustments that had shaped a reality I had accepted without question. And for the first time, I asked myself something I had not allowed before. What would happen if I stopped participating in that version of reality altogether? I did not mean confrontation. I did not mean arguments or explanations. I meant something simpler. Absence. The same absence they had grown used to, but this time, chosen by me. I finished my coffee and stood up, placing the cup in the sink with a steadiness that felt deliberate. Then I did something small, almost insignificant. I did not reach for my phone. I did not check for messages. I did not look to see if anyone had called or texted. I let the silence remain exactly as it was. That was the first change. It did not feel dramatic. It felt controlled. Later that day, Daniel called. His name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, I simply looked at it, noticing how unfamiliar it felt to see his name without the expectation of answering immediately. I let it ring, not out of spite, not out of anger, but because I wanted to see what would happen if I did not respond in the way I always had. The call ended. A few seconds later, a message appeared. "Hey Mom, just checking in. Call me when you can." I read it once, then set the phone down again. I did not respond right away. I waited. Not hours, not to make a point, but long enough to feel the difference between reacting and choosing. When I finally did call him back. That evening, my voice was calm, steady, unchanged. I asked how he was. I listened to him talk about work, about the children, about small details that filled the space between us. He did not mention the lake house. He did not mention the weekend. And I did not ask. That was the second change. I stopped asking questions that required honesty from someone who had been living in a version of truth that did not include me. Over the next few days, I made more small adjustments. I did not offer to host dinner. I did not suggest visits. I did not remind anyone of dates or events. I let everything remain exactly as it was, except for my participation in it. And what I noticed was not immediate. There was no sudden realization on their side, no urgent messages asking where I had been. Life continued for them in the same steady way it always had. But for me, something else began to take shape. A sense of distance that was no longer imposed, but chosen. I began to see my time differently, my energy, my presence. I spent an afternoon walking through a nearby park, something I had not done in years, not because I did not have the time, but because I had always chosen to spend it waiting, preparing, being available. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that comes with early fall, and I found myself noticing small details I had overlooked before, the sound of leaves underfoot, the quiet conversations of people passing by, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees. It was not a grand realization. It was something quieter. I had been so focused on maintaining my place in their lives that I had not noticed how much of my own life had been placed on hold. That afternoon, sitting on a bench with nothing to do and nowhere to be, I understood something that felt both simple and profound. I did not need to fight for a place where I had been carefully removed. I needed to decide what I would do with the space that had been created in its absence. And once that thought settled in, clear and steady, I felt a kind of calm I had not experienced in a long time. Not because anything had been resolved, but because for the first time, I was no longer waiting for someone else to define my place in the story. It was about a week later when everything came together, not in a dramatic confrontation, not in raised voices or accusations, but in a moment so ordinary that it almost passed unnoticed, except this time, I was paying attention. Daniel invited me to dinner. That alone was unusual. He sounded hesitant on the phone, as if he was unsure of how the invitation would be received, and for a brief moment, I considered declining. But instead, I agreed, my voice calm, my tone unchanged, because I wanted to see what would happen when I stepped back into a space that had slowly been closed to me. The evening was cool, just under 60 degrees, and I remember noticing the way the light from their house spilled onto the driveway as I pulled in, warm and familiar, as if nothing had changed at all. Rachel opened the door with that same composed smile, polite, welcoming, just enough warmth to appear genuine without inviting anything deeper. The children greeted me with excitement, and for a moment, I let myself feel it, not as something I had lost, but as something that still existed, separate from everything else. Dinner was already set. The table looked exactly the way I used to imagine it, plates arranged neatly, candles lit, everything in its place. I sat down, observing quietly, not searching, not questioning, just noticing. Daniel talked about work. Rachel added details. The children laughed. It was seamless, too seamless, as if every part of the evening had been rehearsed, not consciously, but through repetition. At one point, Rachel mentioned an upcoming weekend at the lake house, speaking casually, as if it were just another plan. She described it in detail, the activities, the schedule, the guests. I listened carefully, not to the content, but to the structure of the conversation. There was no pause, no glance in my direction, no moment where my presence required acknowledgement in relation to those plans. I was sitting at the table, yet I was not part of what was being discussed. It was the clearest moment I had experienced so far, not because it was different, but because it was exactly the same as everything that had come before. Only now I could see it without confusion. I set my fork down gently and looked at Daniel. He met my eyes for a brief second, then looked away, not out of guilt, but out of habit. He was not hiding anything. He simply did not see what was missing. That was when I understood the final piece. This was never going to correct itself. There would be no moment where he suddenly realized what had been done, no realization that would restore things to the way they had been. Because in his mind, nothing was broken. The version of reality he had been given was complete. I felt no anger in that moment. No need to explain or defend. Instead, I felt something else, something quieter, more resolved. I had spent years trying to remain part of a story that had been rewritten without me. Sitting there at that table, I realized I no longer needed to be written back into it. When dinner ended, I stood up, thanked Rachel for the meal, hugged the children, and turned to Daniel. He asked if I would be joining them at the lake house that weekend, the question coming late, almost as an afterthought. I looked at him for a moment, not searching for anything, just seeing him as he was, and I answered simply, "No, I have other plans." It was not a lie. For the first time in a long time, it was the truth. I walked out of the house and into the cool night air, closing the door gently behind me. And as I made my way to my car, I felt a sense of clarity settle in, steady and complete. They had not forgotten me. They had not pushed me away in anger or conflict. They had simply continued forward without me, guided by something I could not control and no longer needed to understand. And as I drove home, the streetlights passing one by one, I realized something that brought a quiet sense of peace. I had not lost my place in their lives. I had finally seen it for what it was, and that was enough.